Caitlin Clark sat down for an interview, flashed a calm smile, and delivered 6 simple words that sent shockwaves through the entire WNBA. This wasn't during a game, and it didn't come after a tough loss. It happened while she was recovering from an injury, at a time when most athletes choose to stay quiet and avoid headlines. But Clark did the opposite. She spoke up. At that moment, the league was already under intense pressure. Officials were facing heavy criticism, fans were frustrated, and the commissioner had just made decisions that only added fuel to the fire. Tension was building everywhere. Meanwhile, Clark had been watching everything unfold from the sidelines. While she was focused on healing, she was also paying close attention to the bigger picture. Boy, what seemed like a simple remark during a casual interview turned out to be anything but accidental. The timing was perfect, the platform mattered, and every word felt carefully chosen. The league wasn't ready for it, and they didn't have an answer. Stick around, because what happened after that moment didn't just create headlines. It shifted the balance of power in women's basketball in a way nobody expected. And the truth is, the storm had already started long before Clark said anything. Even before those 6 words left her mouth, the WNBA was dealing with serious turbulence. The 2024 season was supposed to mark a turning point for the league. Ticket sales were smashing records, television ratings were climbing, and a new wave of excitement was sweeping through women's basketball. For the first time in years, the league felt like it was truly gaining momentum.
Clark. Wow!
Caitlin Clark's move from Iowa to the WNBA instantly changed the landscape of women's basketball. After finishing her college career with a historic 3,951 points, the all-time NCAA scoring record, she didn't just bring talent to the league, she brought an entirely new wave of fans. Suddenly, people who had never paid attention to the WNBA were tuning in. Jerseys were flying off shelves. Indiana Fever games at home were packed to the rafters. Even road arenas were selling out when Clark came to town. Buildings that had struggled to fill seats for years were now turning fans away because there simply wasn't enough room. On the surface, it looked like a golden moment for the league, but behind the excitement, a problem was slowly growing. Officiating had started to become a major talking point, and it wasn't just the occasional missed call that happens in every sport. Fans were beginning to notice a pattern. Within minutes of games ending, clips were flooding social media. On platforms like Twitter and Reddit, viewers were breaking down plays frame by frame, highlighting moments where contact clearly occurred, but referees kept their whistles silent. Hard fouls were overlooked, reaches that seemed obvious went uncalled. And with every new example, frustration inside arenas and online kept getting louder. It wasn't only the fans who were upset. Players were frustrated, coaches were frustrated, and the league's response only seemed to make the situation worse. Commissioner Kathy Engelbert stepped into the conversation with a statement that quickly became one of the most controversial moments of her leadership. She suggested that teams who are winning don't usually complain about officiating. The comment was likely meant to calm the discussion, basically telling teams that if they were unhappy, they should focus on playing better. Instead, it had the opposite effect. Fans interpreted the remark as dismissive. Players felt like their concerns were being brushed aside. To many inside the league, it sounded like the commissioner was telling a locker room full of professionals that their frustrations weren't worth addressing, and that didn't sit well. Several star players had already been fined for criticizing referees publicly. All coaches were also facing penalties for comments made during post-game press conferences, even when they were simply voicing what everyone watching the game could clearly see. The league's stance seemed simple: handle it privately, stay quiet publicly, and trust the system to deal with the issue. But there was one big problem with that approach. The same questionable calls kept happening, the same patterns kept appearing, and fans holding video clips on their phones weren't about to stay silent just because the league preferred the conversation to disappear. This was the situation Caitlin Clark was observing from the sidelines. At the time, she wasn't even on the court. A nagging shin injury had forced her to miss stretches of the season, leaving her watching everything unfold from the bench.
Gilbert, the first commissioner of the WNBA.
For Caitlin Clark, the injury created a strange kind of limbo. Every day felt uncertain. She couldn't build momentum, couldn't follow a normal routine, and some mornings she didn't even know how her body would feel when she woke up. For most athletes, that kind of situation leads to silence. They step away from the spotlight, focus strictly on rehab, and avoid anything that might create headlines until they're healthy again. Clark didn't disappear. Instead, she became quiet in a different way. She slowed down and observed. Being still doesn't mean doing nothing. It means paying attention. It means thinking, analyzing, and preparing for the right moment. And from the sideline, Clark had a perspective most players never get during the chaos of a season. When you're playing every night, on your world becomes small, focused only on the next opponent, the next possession, the next play. But Clark, stuck on the bench, could see the bigger picture. She watched who seemed to get the benefit of the whistle and who didn't. She noticed when referees called tight games, and when they suddenly let everything go. Patterns began to stand out in ways they normally wouldn't during the intensity of competition. And she wasn't just casually watching, she was studying. Those around the Indiana Fever later revealed that Clark spent a huge portion of her recovery time reviewing game footage. Not just her own highlights or her team's plays, but games from across the entire league. Matchups that had nothing to do with her team. Teams she wasn't even facing. She was observing how officials handled different situations, how certain calls were made, and when they weren't. Little by little, she was putting together a much larger picture. While other players were locked into their own nightly battles, Clark had the rare advantage of seeing the entire board from above. And when you step back far enough, patterns that are invisible during the heat of competition suddenly become clear. She wasn't just rehabbing her injury, she was gathering information. Eventually, the moment came when she decided to speak. But even that decision wasn't random, and that's where many people misunderstood what happened. Clark didn't blurt something out during a rushed media scrum after practice, the kind where reporters fire off the same predictable questions and players respond with safe, carefully worded answers. She also didn't toss a comment onto social media where a single sentence could be clipped, stripped of context and dismissed as emotion or frustration. Instead, she chose a much more deliberate stage. She made the comment on Sue Bird's podcast, and that decision carried far more intention than most people realized. Sue Bird isn't just another former player with a microphone. She's a WNBA legend, a Hall of Famer, and one of the most respected voices the sport has ever produced. When conversations happen in that space, they're taken seriously.
Man, that left foot. That looks very painful, and she is snubbed.
Sue Bird's voice carries enormous respect in the world of basketball, and for good reason. Her resume speaks for itself: 4 Olympic gold medals and 4 WNBA championships. When she finally stepped away from the game, the farewell she received wasn't just polite applause. Players, coaches, and even longtime rivals stood and honored her career. It felt less like a retirement and more like a celebration of everything she had given to the sport. That kind of reputation isn't built overnight. It comes from years, decades of showing up with professionalism, leadership, and integrity, and that same credibility carries over to her podcast. When serious topics are discussed there, they aren't treated like cheap headlines or attention-grabbing hot takes. They're viewed as thoughtful conversations. Sports journalists cover them. Entertainment outlets pick them up. Writers who focus on culture and social issues in sports reference them. It's one of the rare platforms in women's basketball where a player can speak honestly about complicated issues without immediately being framed as controversial. So when Caitlin Clark chose that stage, she wasn't just making a comment, she was giving her words weight. A quick remark on social media could have been misinterpreted or brushed aside. A rushed answer in a press conference might have disappeared by the next news cycle. But speaking on Sue Bird's podcast added a layer of credibility that those other platforms simply couldn't provide. It was Clark's way of signaling something important. This isn't random. This isn't emotional. This is a serious point being made in a space that respects the game. And the timing was just as calculated. Her words didn't arrive during a quiet moment in the season. They landed when debates about officiating in the WNBA were already reaching a boiling point. Fans were frustrated, discussions were everywhere online, and people were waiting, whether they realized it or not, for someone with enough visibility and credibility to finally say what everyone else was thinking. Clark didn't create the moment. She stepped into it at the exact right time, on the exact right platform, with the exact right message. So when she leaned forward, completely calm, almost like she was making a casual observation, and said the now famous line, "I wouldn't miss a call." It wasn't accidental. That sentence came from someone who had spent weeks watching, studying, and waiting for the perfect opportunity. It was delivered the same way Clark launches one of her deep pull-up threes. Quiet confidence, precise timing, and absolute intent. Just 6 words, softly spoken, but the impact was enormous. Within minutes of the clip hitting social media, it exploded. It didn't slowly gain attention over the course of a day. It spread instantly. The video was clipped, captioned, and reposted across thousands of timelines almost immediately. Fans weren't just sharing it, they were reacting to it. Soon, #ClarkWasRight began trending across social platforms. And it didn't stay limited to basketball discussions. The conversation spilled into the broader sports world, entertainment pages, and news feeds that rarely talked about the WNBA. People started digging up clips from games Clark wasn't even playing in, moments where questionable calls had been made or obvious fouls had gone unnoticed. They posted those videos, tagged Clark, and connected everything back to those 6 words. In the process, something unexpected happened. Caitlin Clark became something the league had never really experienced before. A single player unintentionally acting as a kind of public accountability figure for the sport. Every questionable whistle suddenly had context. Every missed call now had a ready-made caption. Clark never asked for that role, but the internet gave it to her anyway.
Powerful words there from one basketball Hall of Famer to another. Fans at Gamble Pavilion saw UConn legend Sue Bird become the 3rd player in program.
Behind closed doors, the situation inside the league quickly became tense. According to people familiar with the WNBA's internal conversations, leadership was split almost immediately after Clark's comments started going viral. The first 48 hours were filled with serious debate about how to respond. One group of executives believed the league needed to act quickly. Their idea was to contact Clark directly and remind her that publicly questioning officiating, especially the integrity of referees, crosses an unwritten boundary in professional sports. Their plan was to deal with the situation the way uncomfortable issues had always been handled before, quietly and behind the scenes. Let the conversation cool down. Don't fuel the headlines. Let the moment fade away. But others in the room saw a major problem with that approach. Caitlin Clark wasn't just another player speaking out. She was the athlete filling arenas that had struggled to sell tickets for years. Her games were drawing television ratings the league hadn't seen in over a decade. Sponsors had poured in new money, largely because of her popularity, and broadcast networks had built entire marketing campaigns around her presence on the court, trying to publicly pressure or silence. That kind of star carried serious risk. Because in today's social media era, if a league appears to target its most popular player, the backlash can be immediate and overwhelming. And when that player has millions of followers, the story doesn't disappear with a carefully worded press release. At the same time, another layer of tension was building behind the scenes: the referees themselves. Reports suggested that some officials viewed Clark's comment as a direct criticism of their professionalism. Watching the clip spread across social media, seeing fans repeat her words every time a questionable call happened, suddenly put referees under an intense spotlight. To some of them, it felt like they had been turned into villains in a story they never asked to be part of. But even within the officiating community, the reaction wasn't unanimous. Privately, there were quiet acknowledgments that the inconsistencies Clark hinted at weren't completely imagined. Data from earlier in the season had already pointed to irregular patterns in foul calls, something coaches and analysts had reportedly been discussing internally for months. A few officials even admitted behind the scenes that Clark's criticism wasn't coming out of nowhere. She had clearly been paying attention. In other words, she wasn't guessing. She had evidence. She just hadn't laid it all out publicly. Then the league made the decision that would ultimately define this entire moment. They chose not to respond at all. No official statement, no clarification, no defense of the officiating crews, not even a carefully crafted comment about the league's commitment to fairness. Just silence. And as the story grew louder with each passing hour, that silence began to speak volumes. Every day the league stayed quiet. Clark's perspective filled the space left behind. Sports talk shows replayed the clip again and again. Podcasts dedicated entire episodes to breaking down her comment and what it meant. Meanwhile, fans kept adding fuel to the conversation, posting new videos, highlighting new calls, and sharing more examples that seemed to support her point. Before long, the story stopped being about one player's remark. It turned into a nationwide debate about something much bigger: whether the WNBA, at a moment when it was experiencing its biggest surge of growth in years, was truly prepared to handle the spotlight that came with it. There's a basic rule every crisis communication expert understands: if you don't shape the narrative yourself, someone else will do it for you. In this case, the WNBA left that role open, and Caitlin Clark ended up defining the conversation. But the situation wasn't just about basketball or public relations. Money was involved too. And once you look at that side of the story, the league's silence starts to make a lot more sense. But because the WNBA's explosion in popularity during the 2024 season was tied to Clark's presence in a way that simply couldn't be ignored.
Honestly, it's really hard for me to wrap my head around understanding that.
Whenever Caitlin Clark was in the lineup, the impact was impossible to miss, especially on the road. Attendance numbers for Indiana Fever away games surged dramatically. Arenas that had struggled for years to fill seats were suddenly packed from wall to wall. Some teams even reported sellouts for the first time in years. These weren't small bumps in attendance either. Entire buildings were filling up, and venues that once operated at half capacity were now turning fans away at the door. Television ratings followed the same trend. Games featuring Clark were drawing viewership the WNBA hadn't experienced in more than a decade. Networks that had once been hesitant about committing serious resources to women's basketball suddenly found themselves reevaluating their position. The momentum was obvious, and sponsors were paying attention. Eastern corporate investment began climbing, and much of that interest was directly tied to Clark's visibility. Brands that had never been deeply involved with the WNBA before were now signing deals and appearing courtside. Marketing teams repeatedly pointed to the same reason behind their enthusiasm: the new audience Clark had brought with her. Younger fans were discovering the league because of her, and many of them weren't just casual viewers, they were becoming dedicated followers of the sport. When that kind of financial energy enters a league, the balance of power quietly shifts. It's not written in any official rule book, but it's real. Soon whispers started circulating across fan communities, insider circles, and even business media outlets that normally don't cover basketball. Reports suggested that some corporate partners had begun privately urging league leadership to strengthen protections for star players. They weren't making public demands. These conversations were happening behind closed doors. But Clark's name reportedly kept coming up. The reasoning was simple and blunt. If Clark continued getting hurt or missing games, the very numbers everyone was celebrating could start falling just as quickly as they had risen. One source connected to a broadcast partner reportedly described the situation in purely business terms. Clark's presence on the court wasn't just a basketball matter. It had become a financial variable. That distinction matters. It meant the pressure facing the league wasn't coming only from fans online or players speaking out. It was also coming from the companies and partners whose investments were fueling the WNBA's growth. And in boardrooms, those conversations carry a different kind of influence than a trending hashtag. At the same time, another narrative was gaining traction among fans. Across Reddit threads and social media discussions, a theory began spreading, never officially proven, but repeated often enough to gain attention. Some believed certain rival teams were defending Clark with a level of physicality that went beyond normal competition. The claim wasn't just that opponents were playing tough defense. The suggestion was that some players were deliberately targeting her with the goal of wearing her down, or even pushing her toward injury. The logic behind the theory was straightforward. Take Clark off the floor, and the Fever become less dangerous. The spotlight on the league dims, and the one player capable of reshaping the entire season's commercial narrative disappears. Whether that idea was true or not almost became irrelevant, because once enough people start believing something, the perception itself creates pressure. Soon, discussions about adjusting rules around aggressive defensive tactics, especially against marquee players, started gaining traction. And it wasn't just fans pushing the idea. People connected to the league, including analysts and industry observers who understood the financial stakes, began raising similar questions. Then another development surfaced that made the situation even more complicated. Multiple reports, unconfirmed but consistent, suggested that league officials had quietly started discussing the possibility of adjusting officiating guidelines in the middle of the season. That kind of move is extremely rare. Changing rules while a season is already underway sends a message that's difficult to control. It suggests that something wasn't working, that the people in charge recognized the issue and felt pressure to respond. And that's the dilemma the WNBA suddenly found itself facing. If they made changes, it could look like an admission that Clark's criticism had been accurate from the beginning. But if they did nothing, the controversy would only keep growing. At that point, the league found itself stuck between two difficult choices. If they stayed silent, your business partners would keep asking questions and applying pressure behind closed doors. But if they spoke out too strongly, the public narrative, already leaning in Clark's favor, could turn even more sharply against them. Neither option looked good, and the uncomfortable truth was that the league had backed itself into that situation by remaining quiet when a clear and confident response might have reshaped the conversation earlier. Then Caitlin Clark returned from injury. The moment she stepped back on the court, the spotlight was enormous. Cameras followed her every move, not just because fans were excited to see her play again, and not just because the Indiana Fever needed their star back. There was another reason. Everyone inside that arena knew exactly what had been said in the weeks before. Fans, media members, players, even coaches, and yes, the referees working that game were all fully aware of the conversation surrounding officiating. Clark's first game back didn't feel feel like a typical return. It felt like a public test. Every time she attacked the rim, the crowd leaned forward. Every moment of contact made the arena hold its breath. And every whistle, or every moment when a whistle didn't come, was instantly captured on phones, clipped, and posted online before the next possession even began. This wasn't ordinary game analysis. It was something far more intense. The entire basketball community had essentially turned itself into a real-time review system, watching closely for every call. And in the middle of it all, Clark had become the measuring stick. At one point, she absorbed a hard hit with no foul called and simply gave a look, calm, on, almost slightly amused. It was the same expression she'd worn during that conversation with Sue Bird. The crowd reacted immediately, not with confusion, but with recognition, like they were witnessing the exact scenario she had hinted at weeks earlier. In that moment, something unusual had happened. Clark had managed to position herself as the benchmark the league would now be judged against. Before her comment, complaints about officiating in the WNBA were mostly background noise. A frustrated remark here, a fine there, maybe a carefully worded statement that avoided saying anything too direct. Players understood the unwritten rule. Keep criticism inside the locker room, avoid public headlines, and let the league handle its image. That system worked for years because no single player had enough influence to challenge it without facing serious consequences. Clark changed that dynamic, and she didn't do it with anger or a heated rant or a long statement prepared by public relations teams. She did it with 6 calm words delivered on a respected platform. After that, the internet took over. What began as one player's observation quickly turned into something much larger, an online movement the league wasn't fully prepared to manage. But the bigger concern for WNBA leadership might not be what already happened, it's what comes next. Younger players across the league are watching this situation closely. Inside locker rooms, lessons travel quickly, and the message many of them are seeing is simple. A player with enough influence, the right platform, and strong fan support can publicly challenge decisions made by the league, and have the audience rally behind them. That represents a new kind of power. It doesn't require a union vote or a formal grievance process. It runs on visibility, credibility, and timing. If that model spreads, the WNBA could be entering a period where public pressure becomes a common strategy instead of a last resort. And it wouldn't stop with officiating. Players could start using that same approach to push conversations about travel conditions, marketing priorities, salary structures, and how revenue from record-breaking seasons is shared with the athletes driving that growth. Sports history shows that this kind of shift isn't unusual. NBA players use their collective visibility to push major conversations around social justice. NFL athletes brought safety concerns into the spotlight until rule changes followed. And the United States women's national soccer team spent years fighting for pay equity in full public view until the issue couldn't be ignored. Moments like this tend to mark the beginning of something bigger.
Team USA, or at least the women's national team, they are preparing for the 2027.
Throughout sports history, major change often begins the same way, with one voice strong enough and respected enough to speak first. Once that barrier is broken, everything else starts to move. Right now in the WNBA, that voice belongs to Caitlin Clark. Whether the league fully embraces that reality or not is another question entirely. What remains uncertain is how leadership will respond moving forward. Will they push back against the influence she's gained? Or will they adapt and learn how to operate alongside it? Challenging Clark publicly carries clear risks. She represents too much of what the league currently needs. New fans, higher revenue, and a level of public attention the WNBA has been working toward for years. She also connects strongly with younger audiences, the exact demographic the league has been trying to attract. But going the opposite direction, agreeing with every concern she raises, creates its own complications. Doing that could establish a precedent where one player's voice begins shaping decisions far beyond her own career. Either way, one thing is undeniable. The WNBA is not the same league it was before those 6 words were spoken, and the people working inside league offices understand that, even if they haven't openly admitted it. Caitlin Clark didn't start a conflict. What she did was reveal a tension that had already been building beneath the surface. surface. With just 6 carefully delivered words, a rookie watching from the sidelines managed to shake an entire professional league. Her comments sparked internal debate among executives, unsettled referees, and ignited a nationwide discussion about who really holds influence in women's basketball. She didn't need a formal press conference. She didn't need legal statements or a public campaign. All she needed was the right timing, the right setting, and the right message. And she had all 3, no matter what direction the WNBA takes next. This moment will remain part of its story. The league now faces a choice: evolve alongside the players helping reshape the sport, or risk falling behind the momentum they've created. If this breakdown helped you see the bigger picture, pass it along to someone else who follows the game. Because in sports, the most important moments aren't always the ones that show up on the scoreboard.